Have you ever watched a stream game from a major event and one of the players just passes the turn when if they did something only a little bit differently they could have easily taken a knockout, and then they go on to win the game, and not only do they win the game but that ends up being the only play that could lead to them winning? When I first started playing the TCG, I watched a ton of games from all different eras and all different formats, and this was always one of the things that I found the most interesting, when players could find the time in the game when they needed to just like retreat to a single prize Pokemon and pass the turn, or use an ability to draw a couple cards instead of attacking, and they end up going on to win the game, and it was the perfect play. Took me a little while to figure out that they were choosing not to attack for the turn instead of like making a mistake, and then it took me a few more years to figure out why. Now it would be pretty much impossible for me to go through every single scenario that would lead to just passing the turn like this being the correct decision, and I don't even think I know every scenario. I can explain the concept that will help you recognize when making a weird play like this is the correct play to make. Not only does it help in these situations, but it's something that every player should be thinking about in every single match that they play, and this is something called the prize trade. In Pokemon, the most common way to win a game is by taking all 6 prize cards. The way that we do that is by attacking and knocking out our opponent's Pokemon. Most Pokemon in the game at the moment are worth 1 or 2 prizes. So the simplest version of a game right now is each player is playing a deck with all 2 prize Pokemon, and each player can attack every single turn, and every attack one-shots the opposing Pokemon. This version of a game would take 3 turns, and the player that attacks first would win every single time. So there are 3 variables here. The first being whoever attacks first, and that's just kind of based off who goes first, and that's whoever wins the coin flip, and that ends up being pretty random. So the remaining 2 variables are how many prize cards each Pokemon is worth, and the number of attacks it takes to knock out a Pokemon. And if we change either of these variables, it will completely change the outcome of who wins the game. Like if we make the player that attacked first have to 2-shot through the first Pokemon, and the second player still 1-shots every Pokemon, now the second player will win. And then if we take that same scenario but make it so that the first player's first Pokemon is worth only 1 prize card, but it still 2-shots the first Pokemon and then 1-shots everything after that, now the player that goes first will win every single time. So just changing these little things completely changes the outcome of the game. And this metaphorical equation that we're changing variables in is what would be the prize trade. And why is this an important thing to know? Say we walk up to a game and this is the board state that we see. Who is winning this game? There are only 2 possible ways to get to an answer, and one is, well, player B has 3 prizes remaining, so clearly they're winning. But I think the more correct way would be using this concept that we just explained, the prize trade, and we notice that while player A still has 6 prizes remaining, they have a board of all 1 prize Pokemon, and player B has all 2 prize Pokemon. Player A is about to start taking 1-shots, and they will win the game in 3 attacks, and since it's their turn to attack now, they'll end up winning the game before their opponent, because this turn they'll attack, go down to 4, their opponent will attack, go down to 2, and then on player A's next turn, they'll be able to tie the game up by going down to 2 prizes, and then it's just simple math of they have all 1 prize Pokemon, the other player has all 2 prize Pokemon, so player B will only be able to go down to 1 prize while player A will win on the following turn. Now this might seem like a pretty extreme example, but anyone that's played a lot of 1 prize decks knows that this is actually pretty common. It's also a good thing to just kind of intuitively know, because it can carry over to other examples, like if we have an all 1 prize board except for 1 Pokemon is worth 2 prizes, we can win the prize trade down 6 to 4 prizes. These kind of numbers are good to know because it just saves a little bit of time. We don't have to sit there and like calculate the back and forth every single game when we just like inherently know these things. Now this leads into an idea that used to be talked about quite a lot, and you'd hear it all the time watching stream games and stuff like that, but I don't hear it very much anymore, and that is the idea of putting your opponent on odd prizes or making them play a 7 prize game. And we do this just by throwing 1 single prize attacker into the game and trying to make it so our opponent can't knock out another single prize Pokemon to get back on even prizes. This does a couple of things. One thing being, it effectively forces our opponent to have to knock out 7 prize cards worth of Pokemon to end up winning the game. and that causes them to have to use one extra turn to attack, and that can be very helpful for, our prize trade and lead to winning the game. The second being, it makes it so that at some point during the game, our opponent will have to go down to one single prize card. This is good because 1 is half of 2, so they'll get half as many cards off of an Iono late in the game. And the second being, if we Iono someone to 2 cards, then they draw for turn. They have 3 cards, they can play an Ultra Ball, and that just opens up a lot more options. Being set to 1 card in hand means you can't play Ultra Ball, and while this would be a lot more effective if like every single deck was playing Lumineon, I think it's still common enough and it's still helpful enough. Like we have Noctowl, Pidgeot, maybe they just need to get one of their attackers out, anything like that. It just leaves them with less options, and our opponent having less options is better for us. Now the thing that I hear more often that is kind of a similar idea is having a single prize board or presenting your opponent with a single prize board. This is why like Goldango is favored against Raging Bolt, because at the beginning of the game, Goldango only has 1 prize Pokemon in play. So Raging Bolt's first attack takes 1 prize, while Goldango's first attack takes 2 prizes, therefore putting Goldango ahead in the prize trade. This is also something that we think about at the end of the game with decks like, I know for a while people were saying that Charizard wants to present a single prize board at the end of the game, so when their opponent is at 2 prizes, they can turbo up their last remaining multi-prize Pokemon in play and present them with a board of like Radiant Charizard and Pidgey and a Charmander, and then the opponent can't win and Charizard can win on the next turn. And this is something we should be actively thinking about in every game that we play. And I mean, of course, our prize map and the prize trade. And prize mapping is figuring out which one of our opponent's Pokemon we're going to knock out to take all 6 of our prize cards and how we're going to do it. This is very helpful as far as resource management goes. We can know what attackers we're going to need, how many recovery cards we're going to need, and we can also start planning on which turns we need to use bosses orders or counter catcher and things like that. It also will let us figure out how many turns it's going to take us to win the game. We also want to do this for our opponent, figure out which one of our Pokemon they want to knock out and what attackers they are going to want to use. And when figuring out our opponent's prize map, we're going to want to kind of use the best case scenario for them. We don't want to plan on them missing a boss or missing an attack or something like that. Planning out our opponent's prize map is helpful for 2 main reasons. 1, it lets us get a general idea of what their plan is going to be so that we can best play around it. And 2, it lets us know how many turns it's going to take them to win the game so that we can then compare our plan versus their plan. And hopefully if we've done everything right, our plan wins the game faster. So hopefully after we do that, our plan is quicker than our opponent's plan. If that is the case, then we're able to just win purely off the back of the prize trade. And that tends to be the easiest, most reliable way to win games. And in those scenarios, we're going to want to just make our board as resilient as possible, and we're going to want to be thinning our deck. Thinning is of course discarding cards we're not going to need to win the game, and we really just kind of want to try to build a board that makes it most likely that we will not whiff an attack and we'll be able to just complete our plan. And of course the second outcome is that our opponent is going to win the game first. This is not ideal, and it might be just as simple as we need to plan to boss an extra turn and knock out more 2 prize Pokemon to win a little bit faster, or we might need to do something like focus down our opponent's support system and plan to Iono them low later in the game and hope they whiff. Hoping that they whiff is a much less dependable thing, but it can work for certain decks or is like a last ditch effort. Figuring out what to do when we're in a losing prize trade situation or just generally a losing situation can definitely be hard to do, and it's a skill that comes from playing a lot of games and being in the same situation over and over again and figuring out what works and what doesn't work and so on. And we don't always need to have played a situation a million times to know what to do. If you think about the game enough, you can kind of play games through in your head a little bit and come up with scenarios and figure out ways to get out of them. The most important thing is that you recognize that you're in a losing situation and try something different. We can't just stick to the same plan and keep attacking like normal, hoping that our opponent is going to either not see their win condition or accidentally click end turn before attacking. I'm just going to recap that section real quick. First, ideally we would have an idea of the prize map or the way we plan to take all 6 prizes for each deck we expect to be popular at the tournament we're preparing for. And we should also have an idea of what those decks want to do to be our deck. During each game that we play, we want to actually take a moment to figure out our prize map and kind of plan it out. We also want to figure out our opponent's prize map and compare their plan to our plan to see who's going to win first. Either we realize that we're winning and we just try to make our board stronger and decrease the odds that we whiff, or we realize that we're losing and we have to do something to get the prize trade back in our favor or try some other sort of win condition. And a win condition is of course the things that need to happen for us to be able to win the game. Every deck has a built-in 100% win condition, whether it's take all 6 prizes or try to deck our opponent out. It's typically a little more nuanced than that, but most often when we're thinking about a win condition, it's when we're losing at the end of a game and we're trying to come up with any type of scenario that would lead to us being able to win. Sometimes these do just involve like fixing the prize trade, but they could be as much of a long shot as hope that our opponent's last prize is a certain card, like their last switch or something like that, so that we can bring something to active until they deck out, or hoping that they don't play an extra super rod and they're all out of energies. And we want to try and always be aware of our opponent's resources and the possible cards that they play in their deck, in case we end up in a situation where we are like losing and need a last ditch effort at the end of a game. But I do just find that it's helpful to kind of think about it in terms of win conditions. Like if we're in a losing situation, just try and think of a couple possible win conditions and figure out which one we think is most likely and just go for it. And of course, this all goes out the window in like game 1 of a best of 3. In that situation, we would just scoop and try to win the next game. Now, there are many ways to either try and fix the prize trade or just manipulate it. Some of them almost any deck can do, and they kind of fall into general categories. Like the most simple one that almost every deck should be able to do is try and force our opponent to take a 1 prize knockout for a turn. I've talked about that a few times already. So that would be making our opponent take less prize cards. Another thing would be to try and stop our opponent from taking prize cards at all. This would be like retreating a damaged Pokemon to the bench that they plan to 2-shot, or forcing them to 2-shot something that they plan to 1-shot. This usually requires like maybe a tool card or some kind of attack that lowers damage. We could also try to make it so that they don't attack at all. This involves bringing something active that they can't attack with or retreat, and either sniping the bench, or in some situations having it sit there until they deck out. We could also plan to attack with something that they can't attack back, like Mimikyu or Cornerstone Ogerpon. Now, some of these examples are very deck specific, but these are examples of tech cards that decks can play to fix certain matchups. And we want to be kind of careful when adding too many techs to our deck, or really many techs to decks at all right now, because there's so many different viable decks that you really have to factor in what are the odds that I even face this deck that I'm adding this card for, or is this a win more card? A win more card would be a card that helps you win in a matchup that is already pretty favorable, or helps you win in a matchup that could be won by just better play, or a different plan that doesn't require extra cards being added to the deck. I bring this up because this is the kind of stuff we should be thinking about when we're making our game plans for certain matchups. Not every deck has a good matchup into every other deck, so either a tech card is needed, a plan is needed, or you just kind of accept that more than likely we're going to lose that matchup, and if we win, it's either by luck or our opponent not playing well or something like that. And in this current format, there are quite a few cards that can really manipulate the prize trade and mess with it a lot. Those are cards like Briar, Dusknoir, Iron Hands, even Dialga V-Star. And this kind of goes into the category of cards that you would put into a deck to plan for certain matchups or to win in certain situations when you fall behind, things like that. It's also not very typical for a format to have this many cards that mess with the prize trade this much. I don't really expect us to keep getting reprints of cards like that, and I imagine either next year or the year after that, cards like this will be gone and we won't have so many of them. That being said, they are definitely cards that we want to think about when making plans for matchups, or when making our prize map during a game. We have to consider, do they play Briar? Are they going to be able to take a 3 prize knockout with Iron Hands? And we have to factor in if our opponent is going to knock out a Dusknoir to knock out one of our Pokemon, then that gives us a prize and kind of messes with our prize a little bit, but we can kind of plan around that and make it so that it's less hospitable for them to just be giving up prize cards. As far as Briar goes, we're going to want to try to play around going down to 2 prize cards if we can. And with Dusknoir, often the opponent has to set it up preemptively and it's really obvious what their plan is to do, and can play around that sometimes by, instead of knocking out the 1 prizer in the active, bossing up like Rotom or something if it's Charizard and going down to 1 prize so that they don't even have the option to use the Dusknoir anymore. Decks are often even categorized as far as how they plan to go about the prize trade. Like prize race decks, Miraidon, Raging Bolt, Roaring Moon, these decks are just trying to take knockouts as fast as possible and run your opponent off the board. They often don't have many good ways to catch up from behind, but they're really fast and consistent, so they can be hard to deal with and really take advantage of when a deck stumbles. There are disruptive decks that are trying to slow the game down, like Gardevoir, Iron Thorns, Dragapult Iron Thorns. They're trying to stick something in the active effective to kind of disrupt their opponent or feed them one prizers and build a big board and catch up on the prize trade at the end of the game, combining disruption and big attacks. Or in the case of Iron Thorns, by combining disruption with constant pressure throughout the game. Then there are decks like Terrapagos, Charizard, Regidrago, regular Dragapult decks. They plan to make up for the prize trade by taking extra knockouts throughout the game with either Dragapult's damage counter spread on the bench or using a Dusknoir or a Briar to cheat an extra prize card. And all these decks generally play pretty differently, and it can be beneficial no matter which kind of deck you play to have experience with these other types of decks to know what they want to do. And of course the best decks aren't so linear. They often favor one of these types but can combine the other strategies when needed. And then there's also decks that don't plan to take prizes at all, like control decks, but they really have to reverse prize map more, where they have to really be thinking about how their opponent is planning to take all the prize cards and only play around it and not try to like go faster than them. But that's a topic for a different video. Now I'm going to go over the end of a stream match that happened a couple regionals ago, where the player realized they were behind in the prize trade and came up with a really cool plan to figure out how to win the game. I think this is a great example of one of the plays I was talking about earlier, when it is correct to not just attack and instead pass for a turn and wait for a bigger play. We have our player on the left, the Regidrago player, and then our Charizard player on the right is the one that is going to make this cool play. Now he is down 4-2 prizes. So the Drago player only has to take one more knockout, and he has a Fezandipiti on the bench and a fully built up Regidrago. Also notably, him being on 2 prizes, that makes Briar active, but since our Charizard player needs to take 4 prizes, he needs to also get a Dusknoir out and a Briar. He just needs a whole mess of stuff. I thought this was really cool when I saw it happen. So our Charizard player here is, you can kind of tell they're planning out their turn, thinking about how many turns it's going to take them to make this play. They nest balled and I guess they failed it. Oh, they already have the Duskull in their hand, and now they are going to Iono. They also need to hit a counter catcher off the Iono, or I think they might be able to Pidgeot for it, and they still have their Fezandipiti use. It's also a good thing to note that there's only 1 energy on the Charizard. This was for last turn so that the Drago player wasn't able to easily knock out the Charizard EX with a Teal Mask Ogerpon. Now I think he's either going to grab the counter catcher or a card for next turn off the Pidgeot and bring up the Fezandipiti and just pass. And like I was talking about earlier, I find this to be like some of the coolest plays in Pokemon, when players just kind of like realize, all right, I'm in a losing situation. There's no possible way I win here if I just attack. This guy's clearly just going to use Fezandipiti, get into a boss, use the Radiant Charizard to knock out my Fezandipiti and win. So I need to do something a little different. And one of those things involves not letting them draw with their own Fezandipiti. So he retreats to the Charizard, since that is the most HP on a Pokemon. The Pidgeot can be knocked out with just a switch card and Giratina V-Star. Even Lucas thinks that he took the knockout, but he didn't. He just passed. And Lucas was probably like really hoping that he was going to take the knockout there, but he doesn't. So now Lucas has 3 cards in hand and no way to get out of the active spot, and yeah, just in a bad spot. So now Haruki, I'm really bad with some of these names. Haruki is going to search more pieces of his combo. I think right here he's trying to figure out if he has enough of the pieces to make the whole thing happen this turn. And the whole thing, of course, is Rare Candy Dusknoir, play the Briar, pop Dusknoir to knock out the Noctowl, and then knock out this Fezandipiti for 3 prize cards. I think he's missing 1 piece. Yeah, just 1 piece. And he has no Pokemon V in play, so he can't like use Forest Seal Stone, or Forest might already be gone or something like that. So he plays the Arven for the Rare Candy. Candy's in the Dusknoir, and he just passes again. Also, it's important to note, he's been keeping track of Lucas's energy and stuff all throughout the game, like pretty heavily, so he has an idea that Lucas prized 2 energy, and it was unlikely for him to be able to retreat because I think he was down almost all of them. But yeah, as you can see there, he popped the Dusknoir, knocked out the Noctowl, played Briar, and took his 3 prizes. Now, some things to think about there. First of all, the Charizard player had to realize that there was no possible way he could win by just attacking and playing the game normally, and realize that he kind of had to make a risky play and hope that Lucas would miss a way to retreat, because even if he got an energy off of that Iono, he could have retreated and attacked twice into the Charizard and knocked it out. but the chances of that happening were greater than the almost 0% chance of him winning if he had just knocked out the Regidrago and let him use Pheasantipity and get into boss and a fire energy with the Radzard, and he ends up pulling off like a really cool play to win that game. And hopefully there's at least a couple tips or ideas that you guys can throw into your gameplay, help you win some more games. This idea of the prize trade and prize mapping is definitely something that when I started actively planning out my prize map in every game that I played, I noticed that I started winning a lot more games, so wanted to share it with everyone. So yeah, like or dislike, comment and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.